Clara Birch was 53 years old when she buried the last of what she loved and stood alone at the edge of a life that had, in the space of 18 months, been stripped down to almost nothing. It was her husband's own brother, Warwick Birch, who turned her out of the house her husband had built with his hands, declaring before the county clerk that the land had always belonged to the Birch family name and not to a widow with no sons to hold it. What Clara had left after the funeral costs and the lawyer's fees and the long wagon ride out of Larkspur Hollow was $11.40, wrapped in a handkerchief her mother had embroidered 40 years before. With that $11.40 she bought, at a county auction nobody else bothered to attend, the collapsing, rat-chewed, long-shuttered trading post at the crossroads outside the town of Cotter's Bend, Wyoming Territory, a building so far gone that the auctioneer nearly refused to sell it at all, and the townsfolk who did hear of it laughed behind their hands and called her a fool for spending good money on a ruin fit only for kindling. She did not know, as she signed her name to that deed with a trembling hand, that beneath the warped floorboards of that counter lay a secret that would not only save her life, but return to an entire valley of forgotten homesteaders something that had been quietly stolen from them for 11 long years. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Clara Birch. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, a place others have written off the way this town once wrote off an old trading post, we hope you'll tell us in the comments, because sometimes the most overlooked things are holding the most weight. Clara had been born Clara Munson in 1835, in a river town in Ohio where her father kept books for a grain merchant and her mother took in mending to make the numbers stretch further than they wanted to go. It was a modest house, but never an unhappy one, and what Clara remembered most from those years was the particular quiet of her father's study in the evenings, the scratch of his pen, the way he would let her sit at his elbow and watch him balance columns of figures until they came out even, as though there were a kind of peace in things adding up properly. He taught her to read a ledger before she was 10 years old, taught her the difference between an honest entry and a padded one, taught her that a man's true character showed itself most plainly not in his Sunday manners but in the way he kept his accounts when he thought no one else would ever look. Her mother, for her part, taught her patience with her hands, needlework, yes, but also the mending of harness leather, the setting of bones in an injured bird's wing, the long slow work of coaxing a garden out of poor soil. Between the two of them, Clara grew into a woman who trusted careful work over quick promises, and who had learned, without ever being told so directly, that value did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sat quietly in a ledger book. Sometimes it sat quietly in a person. She married Thomas Birch in 1856, when she was 21, a broad-shouldered, soft-spoken carpenter's son with an easy laugh and a habit of humming old hymns while he worked, and together they had gone west in 1859 with a wagon train bound for the Wyoming country, chasing the same restless hope that carried so many families in those years. Not riches exactly, but room enough to build something that was entirely their own. They settled in the valley near what would become Larkspur Hollow, and Thomas built their house board by board over the course of 3 winters, and Clara kept the accounts of their small holding with the same careful hand her father had taught her, tracking every seed planted and every dollar earned so that they always knew to the penny where they stood. They were not wealthy people, but they were, for nearly 30 years, steady people, and steadiness in that country was its own kind of wealth. They had no children who lived past infancy, a grief Clara carried quietly and never discussed even with her closest neighbors, and in later years she came to believe that the absence of children had, strangely, sharpened her attention toward the wider community around her, toward other people's sons and daughters, other people's struggles, in a way that might not have happened had her own hands been full. Thomas's brother Warwick had come out to the territory some years after they did, arriving with considerably less patience and considerably more ambition, and he had never fully forgiven his older brother for what he saw as claiming the better, gentler bend of the valley first. Warwick tried his hand at ranching and failed twice, tried freighting and failed once, and by the time Thomas fell ill in the autumn of 1886 with the lung sickness that would take him the following spring, Warwick had grown into a bitter, calculating man who had spent years quietly building a case in his own mind for why the Birch land should rightfully pass to him rather than to a childless widow. Clara nursed her husband through that long final winter with the same steady hands she had always kept, boiling broths and changing linens and reading to him in the evenings from the one worn book of poems they owned, and when he died in March of 1887 she believed, in her grief, that whatever else the world took from her, the home they had built together would remain hers. She was wrong, and the manner in which she learned she was wrong would become the hinge on which the rest of her life turned. The fall came quickly once it came at all, the way a rotted beam holds its shape right up until the moment it doesn't. Warwick Birch went to the territorial land office within 3 weeks of his brother's burial, armed with an old ambiguously worded filing from 1859 that listed the original claim under both brothers' names as a matter of frontier custom, since Warwick had briefly worked the land with Thomas before striking out on his own venture, and a document Clara had never once seen or been told about. He brought with him, too, a lawyer from the county seat named Priam Todd, a smooth, unhurried man who spoke to Clara with an exaggerated gentleness that she recognized, even in her grief, as the particular gentleness men use when they are about to take something from a woman and want her to thank them for it. There was a hearing. Clara stood before a circuit judge who had ridden through Cotter's Bend only twice a year and who had neither the time nor, it seemed, the inclination to untangle 30 years of a marriage's quiet bookkeeping against the smooth paper certainty of Warwick's filing. Clara had her own ledgers, her own careful records of every improvement and every dollar she and Thomas had put into that land over 3 decades, but a widow's household accounts, however meticulous, carried less weight in that room than a filing bearing a government seal, however dubious its true history. The judge ruled, with what he clearly believed to be reluctant fairness, that the land would pass to Warwick Birch as the surviving male claimant, and that Clara would be permitted 30 days to remove her belongings. She left Larkspur Hollow in April of 1887 with a single trunk, a mule named Solomon that Warwick had grudgingly allowed her to keep because no one else wanted him, and $11.40 that represented the entirety of what remained after she settled her husband's debts and paid Priam Todd's fee, which the court had somehow determined she owed a portion of as well. She had, at 53 years old, no home, no income, no family within 1,000 miles who would take her in, and a body that ached in the mornings in ways it had not ached 10 years before. She rode south along the wagon road with Solomon's lead rope in her hand, sleeping under the stars or in the corner of whatever barn would have her, and she arrived in the small crossroads town of Cotter's Bend on a gray afternoon in early May, footsore and hollowed out, with no particular plan except the vague, half-formed notion that a town large enough to have a church and a feed store might have some small work for a woman who could read a ledger, keep a garden or nurse the sick. It was in Cotter's Bend that she heard, from the loose talk of men outside the feed store, that the county was auctioning off an old abandoned trading post at the north crossroads that afternoon, the estate of a man named Ezra Coltrane who had died without heirs some 3 years before and whose property had sat locked and untouched ever since, slowly surrendering itself to dust and mice and the slow work of Wyoming winters. The men spoke of it the way people speak of a joke everyone already understands, calling it a shame and a waste and a building not worth the nails holding its roof together, and one man laughed that the county would probably have to pay someone to haul the thing down eventually. Clara, standing at the edge of that conversation with Solomon's rope still in her hand and $11.40 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, felt something in her that she could not entirely name, not hope exactly because hope required more warmth than she had left in her that day, but something more like the old instinct her father had given her, the sense that had guided her through 30 years of ledgers, whispering that a thing dismissed too quickly by too many people was worth a second look. The auction that afternoon was a sparse and almost embarrassed affair, held on the porch of the county clerk's office with perhaps a dozen onlookers, most of whom had come only to watch rather than bid. The clerk read out the particulars of the Coltrane estate in a flat, bored voice. 1 building, 1/2 acre lot, contents unknown and presumed worthless, taxes owed exceeding any reasonable value of the property, and asked for an opening bid of $5, which he clearly expected no one to offer. Clara raised her hand before she had entirely decided to do so, and when the clerk, startled, asked if she understood the property came with no guarantee of soundness, she answered that she understood a great many things came with no guarantee of soundness and she had learned to look past that. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the small crowd, not unkind exactly, but the particular laughter reserved for someone thought to be making a fool's bargain. No one raised a competing bid. The gavel came down at $5 and Clara paid it along with $3.40 in back taxes and fees, leaving her with almost nothing at all, and walked away holding a deed to a building that half the town considered an eyesore and the other half had simply forgotten existed. She reached the trading post itself just before sundown, leading Solomon up the overgrown wagon track from the crossroads, and stood for a long while simply looking at it before she tried the door. It was a low, long building of gray, weathered logs with a sagging porch roof and shutters hanging crooked on their hinges, the kind of structure that seemed to be apologizing for itself, and when she finally worked the swollen door open with her shoulder, the smell that met her was of dust and mouse droppings and old leather gone stiff, and cobwebs hung so thick across the front counter that they moved like curtains in the draft from the door. It was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the ruin the townsfolk had called it. But Clara had spent 30 years learning that first impressions in a ledger were rarely the whole story, and so instead of turning away in disgust as most anyone else might have, she set down her trunk, tied Solomon to the porch post, and began, with the same patient hands her mother had taught her, to clean. It took her the better part of 3 days working alone to make even the front room of the trading post fit for a person to sleep in, sweeping out years of dust and dead insects, scrubbing the counter with water hauled from the creek behind the property, prying open shutters that shrieked in protest at being moved after so long. On the evening of the third day, working by the last gray light through the clean front window, she noticed that the long counter at the front of the store, a heavy plank affair built low and solid, clearly meant to survive decades of use, sat slightly higher off the floor on one end than the other, as though something beneath it were propping it unevenly. She knelt, tired as she was, and ran her hand along the underside of the counter's front panel, and felt, beneath a layer of grime, the faint seam of a hidden compartment built into the base. A false panel, fitted so carefully that it would have taken a deliberately searching hand to ever find it. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a bent nail and no small amount of patience, to work the panel free, and when it finally came loose and clattered onto the floorboards, she found herself looking, in the dying light, at a neat stack of oilcloth-wrapped bundles tied with waxed cord, tucked into the hollow space as carefully as a mother tucks a sleeping child into a bed. Her hands shook a little as she untied the first bundle, less from fear than from the peculiar prickling sense that she had stumbled onto something that had been placed there with great deliberate care, by someone who had wanted it found by the right person at the right time and not before. Inside the oilcloth was a stack of legal papers, yellowed but well preserved, and as she carried them closer to the window to catch the last of the light, she realized with a small intake of breath that she was looking at land deeds, not one or two, but dozens of them, each bearing a different family name, each stamped and signed and dated across a span of years from 1876 through 1885, each one describing a parcel of homestead land somewhere in the wider valley around Cotter's Bend. She sat back on her heels amid the dust and the fading light, the papers spread across her lap, and understood that whatever else this ruined little building had been to the town that mocked her for buying it, it had once held, quite literally beneath its own counter, the legal foundation of a great many other people's lives. Over the following days, working carefully by lamplight in the evening so as not to damage the fragile pages, Clara sorted and read through every deed in the hidden cache, and slowly a picture began to assemble itself in her mind, the way a photograph emerges in a chemical bath, faint at first and then unmistakably clear. Ezra Coltrane, she learned from an old water-stained ledger tucked in among the deeds, had not merely kept a trading post at that crossroads. He had for nearly a decade served as the unofficial trusted man of the valley's homesteading families, most of whom could not read well enough to fully trust the land office in the county seat, and many of whom did not trust, with good reason it would turn out, a particular land agent who had set up his business in Cotter's Bend in the early 1880s, under the name of Harlan Roos. According to the notes Clara found scrawled in Coltrane's own careful hand, families would file their claims through Roos's office as required by law, but they would then bring their original deeds to Coltrane, a man they trusted, for safekeeping, because Roos had a habit of misplacing original documents belonging to families who fell behind on the small fees his office charged for filing and recording, after which he would quietly refile the land under new claims in his own name or the names of associates, taking advantage of families too poor, too unlettered, or too far from the county seat to contest it. The ledger made plain that Coltrane had grown steadily more alarmed over the years as he watched this pattern repeat itself, family after family losing land they had proved up honestly, only to find themselves suddenly landless because their original filing had never been properly recorded. He had begun, quietly and at some personal risk, to hold on to the true original deeds himself whenever families brought them to him, intending, his own notes suggested, to eventually gather enough evidence to expose Roos's scheme to the territorial authorities. But Coltrane had died suddenly of a seizure of the heart in the winter of 1884, before he had gathered the courage or the proof he felt he needed, and in the confusion and grief that followed his unexpected death, with no family to settle his affairs and no one aware of what the trading post truly held, the building had simply been shuttered by the county, its contents deemed worthless, and the secret beneath its counter had sat undisturbed for 3 long years, while Clara now understood. With a slow, cold horror, Harlan Roos had continued his quiet theft of the valley's land, family after family, entirely unchallenged, because the very proof that could stop him had been sealed away in a building everyone had already decided was worth nothing at all. Clara spent a full week after that discovery simply thinking, turning the papers over in the lamplight each evening, cross-referencing names in Coltrane's ledger against the deeds themselves, and slowly building in her own careful hand a new ledger of her own, a complete accounting family by family, of what had truly been claimed, what had truly been filed, and what Harlan Roos had since claimed for himself under other names. She recognized, with the particular clarity of a woman who had once watched a courtroom prefer a smooth filing to an honest woman's memory, that paper alone would not be enough this time either. Not against a man who by now, 3 years further into his scheme, had built himself into one of the wealthiest and most outwardly respectable men in the county, sitting on the board of the very bank that held mortgages over half the valley, attending church each Sunday in a fine black coat and speaking at town meetings about the importance of order and proper documentation, as though he were the guardian of honest record-keeping rather than its most patient thief. She would need, she understood, not only proof but standing, and a way to bring both before people who would have every reason to doubt a poor widow arriving from nowhere with a stack of old papers and an extraordinary claim. It did not take long for word to travel through Cotter's Bend that the fool widow who had bought the old Coltrane place had been seen carrying stacks of papers to the county recorder's office, asking careful questions about old filings, and the whispers that had begun as amusement over her purchase curdled quickly into something more suspicious once people began to sense that whatever she had found was not nothing after all. Harlan Roos himself came to call on her at the trading post on a warm afternoon in June, dressed in his fine black coat despite the heat, his manner as smooth and unhurried as Priam Todd's had been in that courtroom in Larkspur Hollow, and he informed Clara, with an air of great personal concern for her welfare, that old buildings such as hers sometimes held documents belonging to the county that were not rightfully hers to keep or to circulate, and that it would go far better for her, given her precarious circumstances, if she simply surrendered whatever papers she had found into his care as a respected officer of the land office, so that proper order might be restored without any unpleasantness. Clara, standing on her own newly swept porch with her mother's old patients settled over her like a shawl, told him only that she had found a great many interesting things in her building, and that she intended to look into all of them very carefully, and thanked him kindly for his concern. The unpleasantness Roos had implied came anyway, in the small, grinding ways such men prefer. The feed store suddenly found itself unable to extend her credit. A delivery of goods she had ordered for the small trading business she had begun to revive was mysteriously delayed for weeks. 2 men she did not recognize came by after dark and rattled the shutters until Solomon's braying woke half the crossroads, though they fled before she could see their faces clearly. The town's sentiment, stirred quietly by Roos's whispered concerns about a strange widow making wild accusations against a pillar of the community, turned wary and cold, and Clara found herself, once again, standing nearly alone against the smooth, patient machinery of a man determined to keep what he had taken. But she had learned something in the wreckage of her marriage's ending that she had not fully understood before losing everything, that being disbelieved was not the same as being wrong, and that a woman who kept her ledgers honestly could afford to be patient in a way that a man hiding a false one could not. She spent that difficult summer building her case with the same steadiness her father had taught her over a boyhood ledger book in Ohio, traveling in Solomon's slow company to homestead after homestead across the valley, sitting at kitchen tables with families who had lost land they still could not entirely explain losing, laying before them the original deeds bearing their own names and dates and watching, again and again, the particular stunned grief and relief that comes when someone realizes proof of a wrong they had quietly carried alone finally exists outside their own memory. She gathered sworn statements alongside the recovered deeds, cross-referenced every filing against Coltrane's careful ledger, and slowly assembled a case so thorough and so plainly documented that even a circuit judge inclined towards smooth paper certainty would find it difficult to dismiss. She wrote, too, to the Territorial Land Office directly in Cheyenne, enclosing copies of the most damning entries from Coltrane's ledger, and she asked a young, earnest newspaperman from the county seat named Arthur Pell, who had grown curious about the whispers surrounding the widow at the old trading post, to come see the evidence for himself before he wrote a single word about her. The reckoning, when it finally came in late August of 1887, arrived not as a dramatic confrontation but as the slow, grinding turn of proper process that Roos himself had always claimed to champion, now turned at last against him. A territorial investigator arrived in Cotter's Bend in response to Clara's letter, and within 2 weeks of quiet, careful inquiry cross-referencing the recovered deeds against the land office's own official filings, the scheme Ezra Coltrane had died trying to expose stood revealed in its entirety, a pattern of falsified refilings spanning nearly a decade and touching more than 30 families across the valley. Harlan Roos was removed from his position at the land office and from the bank board within the same week, his fine black coat suddenly affording him no protection at all, and though the criminal proceedings that followed would take many more months to conclude, the essential truth of what he had done was, by autumn, known to every family in the valley he had wronged. There was no violence in his downfall, no dramatic public humiliation that Clara sought or savored. There was only the slow, satisfying weight of proper paper finally speaking louder than a smooth voice, the very kind of justice her father had once taught her to trust more than any courtroom performance. What mattered far more to Clara than Ruse's disgrace was what came after it. Working alongside the territorial investigator and a newly appointed land agent sent to correct the county's records, she spent the following weeks helping each affected family formally reclaim their true holdings, sitting again at kitchen tables not to deliver grim proof this time but to walk families through the paperwork of restoration, patiently as her father once walked her through a column of figures, until every name that belonged on a piece of land was properly recorded there once more. She refused, when the grateful families offered it, any portion of the land or money as reward for what she had found, saying only that the old trading post and its half-acre had already made her wealthier than she had been in years, and that seemed a fair enough trade for $8.40. She did accept, because refusing would have wounded people who needed badly to give something back, the community's help in properly rebuilding the trading post itself, and by the following spring the building that Cotter's Bend had once mocked her for buying stood restored as a proper trading post and informal record office, its shelves stocked with goods, its counter, the very counter beneath which the valley's stolen deeds had waited 3 long years to be found, polished and solid and trusted once more as a place where honest business was done. Clara Birch, who had arrived in Cotter's Bend at 53 years old with nothing but a mule, a trunk and $11.40, found herself by the following year the quiet, trusted center of a valley that had nearly let its own history rot away out of simple, thoughtless dismissal. She never did recover Larkspur Hollow, and she never sought to. Some doors, she had come to understand, close for good reason, and a woman's strength lies partly in knowing which ones are worth the effort of forcing back open. Warwick Birch, hearing eventually of what his sister-in-law had built and uncovered at Cotter's Bend, sent a stiff, unsigned letter offering a small settlement in exchange for her silence about the manner of the original land ruling, which Clara declined without bitterness, understanding that some men only ever learn to fear consequences and never learn to feel shame, and that she owed him neither her silence nor her anger, only her indifference. She had, in the end, not needed Larkspur Hollow at all. She had built something sturdier out of a ruin nobody else had wanted. It is worth returning now to that gray afternoon when Clara Birch stood at the edge of a laughing crowd with $11.40 sewn into her petticoat and raised her hand for a building everyone else had already written off as worthless. The people of Cotter's Bend had not been wrong exactly about what they saw. The trading post really was rotted and sagging and full of mice, every bit as poor a bargain as it appeared. What they had missed, and what Clara's whole life had trained her to look for, was that appearance and value are not always the same measurement, and that the things a community discards too quickly sometimes hold, quite literally in this case, the proof of what that same community is owed. Clara Birch did not set out to become the woman who restored a valley's stolen land. She set out, in her darkest hour, simply to survive the next few months with the little she had left. But in choosing to look carefully at a thing everyone else had dismissed, in refusing to let a ruin's rough surface tell her the whole of its story, she became something the whole town would come in time to depend on and be grateful for. A woman who understood, better than most, that dignity and worth often wait quietly beneath the counter, for someone patient enough to kneel down and look. We're grateful you stayed with us through Clara's story tonight, through the long fall and the long, patient climb back up out of it, because stories like hers remind us that the world's judgment of what is worthless is very often wrong, and that quiet, careful people are usually the ones who prove it. If this story moved you, we'd love for you to share it with someone who might need reminding that they are not as forgotten as they feel tonight, and to leave a comment for us below. We'll leave you with the same question Clara's life seems to ask so gently. What is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We'd love to hear it from you. Until next time, stay close.